What if the billionaire martial artist wasn't the strongest in the room? The question would have seemed absurd to anyone watching Clara Vance enter the Riverside Dojo that September evening. Her presence preceded her like thunder before lightning, the click of Italian leather against worn wood, the subtle rustle of a jacket worth more than most cars, the way the air itself seemed to reorganize around her authority. 8 years of building a tech empire hadn't softened the edges her Aikido training had sharpened. If anything, the boardroom had made her more dangerous. She moved through space like she owned it, because usually, she did. The dojo's fluorescent lights caught the silver threading in her dark hair, pulled back in a bun so severe it could cut glass. Students preparing for evening practice paused mid-stretch, their bodies instinctively straightening as if she were a general inspecting troops. Clara didn't acknowledge them. Her attention fixed on the lone figure mopping the corner near the weapons rack, a man whose presence was so unremarkable that most people's eyes simply slid past him like water over stone. Daniel Cross worked his mop in patient circles, each movement deliberate, economical. His flannel shirt, faded from countless washes, hung loose on a frame that suggested strength without advertising it. Where Clara commanded attention, Daniel seemed to actively deflect it, as if he'd learned that invisibility was its own form of armor. "You missed a spot," Clara said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made grown executives sweat through their presentations. Daniel didn't look up. The floor doesn't mind waiting. Something in his tone, not defiance exactly, but a complete absence of deference, made Clara's spine straighten further, if such a thing were possible. She stepped closer, her shadow falling across his work like a challenge. "Do you know who I am?" Now Daniel did look up, and Clara found herself staring into eyes the color of winter storms, gray, patient, holding depths she hadn't expected. Someone who thinks the floor cares about your resume. The dojo fell silent. Even the wall clock seemed to pause its ticking. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a sensation she couldn't name, like a key turning in a lock she'd forgotten existed. "Would you like to spar?" The words came out before she could examine them, sharp as a blade drawn from its sheath. Daniel considered this, wringing his mop with the same unhurried care he applied to everything. "Only if you promise not to cry." The silence that followed could have been measured in geological time. Clara Vance, who had made venture capitalists weep and crushed hostile takeovers before breakfast, stood frozen in the middle of a community dojo, staring at a janitor who had just delivered the most unexpected counterstrike of her life. Clara's usual response would have been swift, cutting, designed to re-establish dominance. But something in Daniel's eyes, not mockery, not challenge, but a kind of ancient knowing, kept her words locked in her throat. She turned on her heel and walked to the changing room, her footsteps echoing like a countdown to something she couldn't yet name. The next evening, Clara returned earlier, ostensibly to practice forms before the crowd arrived. But her eyes kept drifting to Daniel as he prepared the space-checking mats for tiers, ensuring weapons were properly secured, moving through his tasks with a quality of attention that made each mundane action seem almost meditative. There was something in the way he moved that didn't match the story his clothes told. His body knew things, old things, earned things, the kind of knowledge that came from places darker than any boardroom. A small boy sat in the corner, maybe 7 years old, sketching in a notebook with the kind of focus usually reserved for surgeons or demolition experts. His hair, the same storm cloud color as Daniel's, fell across his forehead as he worked. Every few minutes, he would look up at his father, as if confirming something, then return to his drawing. "That's Ethan," Master Yamamoto said, appearing beside Clara with his usual talent for materialization. "Daniel's son, quiet boy, sees things." "Sees things?" The old master's eyes crinkled. "The kind of things we spend years learning not to see." As if summoned by the conversation, Ethan stood and walked toward Clara with the purposeful stride of someone carrying something important. He stopped just outside her personal space, close enough to be bold, far enough to be respectful, and held out a piece of paper. Clara took it, expecting a child's drawing of stick figures or rainbow houses. Instead, she found herself looking at a woman standing in rain, rendered with surprising skill. The woman's face was turned skyward, and where the rain touched her, she seemed to be dissolving, becoming part of the storm itself. But it wasn't sadness in the figure's posture, it was something else, something Clara couldn't quite name. "This is," Clara began, then stopped. "Did you draw this just now?" Ethan nodded solemnly. "You look like rain sounds." Before Clara could process this cryptic observation, Daniel appeared, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Ethan, Miss Vance is here to train, not to review your art portfolio." "She needed to see it," Ethan said, with the certainty children possess before the world teaches them doubt. Daniel's eyes met Clara's over his son's head, and she saw something flicker there, recognition perhaps, or warning. Ethan sees what he sees. "I've learned not to argue with it." Clara looked down at the drawing again, and suddenly she was 17, Standing on a mountain in Colorado, rain turning to sleet, her brother Sam's hand slipping from hers, his scream swallowed by the storm. She forced the memory down with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 18 years perfecting that particular motion. "It's very good," she managed, handing the drawing back. "But Ethan didn't take it. It's yours, for when you remember how to get wet." The boy returned to his corner, leaving Clara holding a piece of paper that suddenly weighed more than any contract she'd ever signed. Daniel watched her for a moment longer, then returned to his work, but not before she caught something in his expression, not pity, which would have been unbearable, but understanding, which was somehow worse. That night, Clara stood in her penthouse office, 40 floors above the city, the drawing spread on her desk between quarterly reports and acquisition proposals. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows, and she found herself tracing the figure's dissolving outline with one finger. Her phone buzzed with messages from Beijing, from London, from a dozen fires that needed her attention, but she couldn't look away from a 7-year-old's interpretation of something she'd never told anyone. The memory came anyway, despite all her fortifications. Sam, 2 years younger, always trying to keep up, always pushing himself to match his sister's relentless pace. The storm had come from nowhere, turning their easy climb into a nightmare of ice and wind. She could have turned back, should have turned back. But Clara Vance didn't retreat, didn't fail, didn't show weakness. So she'd pushed forward, and Sam had followed, because that's what Sam did, followed his sister into any challenge, any danger, trusting her completely. The ice gave way under his feet with a sound like breaking bones. His hand in hers for one eternal second, his eyes wide with surprise more than fear, and then nothing but the scream of wind and the scream from her throat and the endless, endless falling. The authorities called it an accident. The mountain was unpredictable, the storm unprecedented. No one's fault. But Clara knew better. She'd chosen pride over safety, image over intuition. Sam had paid the price for her need to be invincible. She'd built her empire on that guilt, each success a brick in a wall between herself and that moment on the mountain. The Aikido training had come later, a way to control her body as ruthlessly as she controlled her emotions, to never again be at the mercy of weakness or hesitation. She'd risen through the ranks with mechanical precision, each belt another layer of armor, until she stood where she stood now, untouchable, unbeatable, and utterly alone. The drawing stared up at her, and Clara realized what Ethan had captured that she'd missed at first glance. The dissolving wasn't destruction, it was integration. The woman wasn't being destroyed by the rain. She was becoming part of it, letting it through instead of standing against it. Her phone rang. Tokyo. Important. She let it go to voicemail. The next evening at the dojo, Clara arrived to find the space fuller than usual. Master Yamamoto had invited a visiting instructor, Sensei Hartwell from the Seattle school, a man whose reputation preceded him like a red carpet he'd rolled out himself. Hartwell stood in the center of the mat, his voice carrying the kind of artificial depth men developed when they confused volume with authority. "Excellence in Aikido," he was saying, "requires complete dedication. It's not something one can pursue casually, between other obligations." His eyes landed on Daniel, who was adjusting the equipment closet door that had been sticking for months. Some people understand that the martial arts demand everything. Others, well, they mop floors. The students shifted uncomfortably. Several glanced at Daniel, who continued working on the door, apparently oblivious to the insult. Clara felt something hot rise in her chest, not embarrassment for Daniel, but anger at Hartwell's casual cruelty, his need to elevate himself by stepping on someone else. Daniel finished with the door, tested it twice, then turned to face Hartwell with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything. "True," he said, his voice carrying despite its quietness. "I mop floors. But I don't mop egos. That seems like harder work." The silence that followed had weight, substance, the kind that pressed against eardrums. Hartwell's face went through several colors, none of them healthy. Master Yamamoto covered what might have been a smile with his hand. "Perhaps," Hartwell said, recovering his composure with visible effort, "you'd like to demonstrate your expertise? Show us all what wisdom comes from? Janitorial excellence?" Daniel shrugged. "I'm good with the floor being clean. It doesn't need to be anything more than it is." Spoken like someone who's never pushed himself toward greatness, Hartwell sneered. "Or someone who's learned the cost of pushing too hard," Daniel replied, and for the first time, Clara heard steel beneath the silk of his voice. She found herself stepping forward before she'd made the decision to move. "I'll spar with him." Every head turned. Hartwell's mouth opened and closed like a fish discovering air wasn't water. Master Yamamoto's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "Miss Vance," Hartwell began, "surely you don't want to waste your time." "I don't waste anything," Clara cut him off. "Daniel, would you mind?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him weighing something, measuring not her challenge but something deeper. Finally, He nodded. Let me change. When he emerged from the changing room, Clara understood what she'd been sensing all along. The comfortable flannel was gone, replaced by a gi that had seen better decades. But it was the way he wore it, not like a costume or even a uniform, but like a second skin he'd never quite shed. His movements had changed too, or rather, revealed themselves. The careful invisibility was still there, but now she could see it for what it was. Not absence, but presence so complete, it didn't need announcement. They faced each other on the mat, bowed, and Clara attacked with the precision that had earned her 8 Dan, a level most people never reached, achieved through years of relentless practice and perfect technique. Daniel moved like water finding its way down a mountain, not avoiding her strikes, but accepting them, redirecting them, turning her force into empty air. He didn't counterattack, didn't try to dominate. He simply existed in the space her violence created, filling it with something that wasn't violence at all. She increased her speed, her power, drawing on techniques that had humbled practitioners with decades of experience. Daniel matched her without matching her, met her without meeting her. It was like fighting smoke, or music, or the idea of resistance rather than resistance itself. And throughout it all, his eyes never left hers, and what she saw there wasn't triumph or strain, but something infinitely more disturbing: compassion. The spar ended when Clara realized she was crying. Not sobbing, not breaking down, but tears running down her face as she moved, as if Daniel's patient acceptance had found cracks in her armor she didn't know existed. She stepped back, bowed, and walked off the mat without a word. In the changing room, she sat on the bench and tried to understand what had just happened. She'd sparred with masters who'd devoted their lives to the art, and none had done what Daniel had just done, shown her how much energy she wasted on winning, on being better, on maintaining the walls she'd built. A soft knock on the doorframe. "Miss Vance?" Daniel's voice, careful but not cautious. "Are you all right?" "How?" she asked without looking up. "How did you learn to move like that?" Daniel was quiet for so long she thought he might have left. Then, "I was a firefighter, 15 years. You learn pretty quick that fighting fire doesn't work. You have to move with it, understand it, respect it. Then one day, a building came down wrong. My wife was inside, part of the search team. He paused, and Clara heard years of practice in that pause, the sound of someone who'd learned to carry weight without showing it. After that, I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't pretend I was fighting anything. Ethan needed a father more than the city needed another hero who thought he could beat back chaos. So now I mop floors, and I raise my son, and I practice not fighting with things that don't need to be fought." Clara looked up then, met his eyes. "I'm sorry about your wife." "Her name was Rachel," Daniel said. She laughed like morning felt. "Ethan has her smile when he uses it." "And you?" Clara asked. "What do you have of hers?" Daniel considered this, the knowledge that some things are worth being broken for, and that being broken isn't the same as being beaten. He left then, and Clara sat in the changing room until the dojo emptied, until the lights dimmed to their after-hours glow, until she could trust herself to walk to her car without shattering. The next week, Clara threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, as if she could bury what had happened at the dojo under enough spreadsheets and conference calls. But every time she passed the window, she saw rain that wasn't there. Every time she signed a document, she remembered Daniel's hands, patient and sure. And every night, Ethan's drawing stared at her from her desk, a child's prophecy she couldn't decode or discard. Thursday arrived with actual rain, the kind that turned the city into an impressionist painting. Clara stood before the dojo, her umbrella unopened in her hand, water running down her face. She'd come to teach the advanced class, but her body felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who didn't know the forms, didn't understand the principles. Inside, the students waited. She began the class, demonstrating a technique she'd performed thousands of times. But when she grabbed the practice partner's wrist, she was suddenly on the mountain again, Sam's hand in hers, slipping. Her grip tightened. The student winced. "You're hurting me," the student said quietly. Clara released him as if burned. The room spun. She heard her own voice, hollow and strange, making some excuse. Then she was in the hallway, her back against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the floor, her designer suit crumpling against institutional tile. "The floor's already crying." Daniel's voice came from above her. No need to add to it. She looked up to find him standing there with his mop and bucket, but his eyes held no mockery. He sat down beside her, not touching, just present, the way a lighthouse is present for ships in storms, not reaching out, but constantly saying, "Here is solid ground." "I killed my brother," Clara said, the words falling out like stones she'd swallowed 18 years ago. "I pushed him to climb in a storm because I couldn't bear to turn back, couldn't bear to fail. He fell. He died. Because I had to win against a mountain." Daniel didn't say it wasn't her fault, didn't offer platitudes about forgiveness or moving on. He just sat there, letting her truth exist in the space between them without trying to fix it or file it away. "How do you stand it?" she asked. "The weight?" "I don't," Daniel said simply. "I carry it. There's a difference. Standing is what you do against something. Carrying is what you do with something. Rachel's death is part of me now, woven through everything like thread through cloth. Pull it out, and the whole thing unravels. So I carry it, and I let it make me softer instead of harder, because that's what Ethan needs, a father who knows how to bend without breaking." Clara felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking but opening, like a door sealed shut so long she'd forgotten it was a door. The tears came then, real tears, the kind she hadn't cried since that day on the mountain. Daniel didn't comfort her, didn't touch her, just sat there being solid while she became liquid, while 18 years of ice melted into salt water on a dojo floor. When the tears finally stopped, she found a small yellow paper crane beside her knee. She looked up to see Ethan standing a few feet away, his young face serious as a priest's. "You were loud," he said solemnly, "because you were scared of being quiet. But quiet is where the soft things live." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her holding a paper crane that weighed nothing and everything. 3 days later, Clara knocked on Daniel's apartment door. It was a modest building in a modest neighborhood, the kind of place her driver had trouble finding because it didn't appear on any of the maps her world used. Daniel answered in jeans and a t-shirt, barefoot, looking somehow more himself than she'd ever seen him. "I brought forms," Clara said, holding up a folder. "Volunteer forms, to be an assistant instructor at the dojo." Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly. "You want to volunteer, to assist. Teaching." "I'm very good at forms," Clara said, hearing how absurd she sounded. "The paperwork kind and the martial kind." A smile ghosted across Daniel's face. "Come in, Ethan's making dinner." Fair warning, he believes spaghetti is a food group. The apartment was small, clean, lived in. Photos covered one wall. Daniel younger, laughing, his arms around a woman whose smile could have powered cities. Ethan at various ages, always with that same serious expression, as if he'd been born knowing things others had to learn. The furniture was mismatched but comfortable, everything chosen for use rather than appearance. Ethan stood on a step stool at the stove, stirring a pot with the concentration of someone diffusing a bomb. He looked up when Clara entered, nodded as if he'd been expecting her, then returned to his work. "She can stay," he announced. "She knows about the crane now." Daniel shot Clara an apologetic look. "Ethan has strong opinions about dinner guests." "Only the ones who matter," Ethan corrected, not looking up from his pot. Clara felt that strange cracking sensation in her chest again, like light finding its way through boards. She set her folder on the counter, rolled up her designer sleeves, and asked, "What can I do to help?" Ethan handed her a wooden spoon without hesitation. "Stir counterclockwise. The noodles get dizzy otherwise." For the first time in 18 years, Clara laughed, really laughed, not the practiced sound she used in boardrooms, but something that came from the same deep place the tears had found. Daniel smiled, and Ethan nodded approvingly, and Clara stirred counterclockwise while the noodles found their balance. Over dinner, eaten at a table that wobbled until Daniel stuck a folded paper under one leg, Clara discovered what she'd been missing in her penthouse with its perfect views and profound emptiness. Ethan talked about school, about a turtle they'd seen in the park, about why clouds looked angry sometimes but were really just heavy. Daniel listened with complete attention, asking questions that showed he found his son's observations as important as any board meeting. They included Clara naturally, as if she'd always been there, as if there was a her-shaped space at their table that had been waiting to be filled. "This is the part where you bow," Ethan said suddenly, holding out a folded piece of paper. Clara took it, unfolded it carefully. Inside, in Ethan's careful handwriting, "Home isn't where you're biggest, it's where you fit." She looked at the boy, this strange, wise child who seemed to see through time itself. "How do you know these things?" Ethan shrugged. "I watch. Most people are so busy being loud they can't hear what the quiet is saying, but you're learning to listen now. Dad taught me that how to listen to the spaces between sounds." Daniel reached over and ruffled his son's hair. "You're getting philosophical again, buddy. Save some wisdom for dessert." "Ice cream isn't wise," Ethan said seriously. "It's just happy." And it was. They ate ice cream from mismatched bowls, and Clara learned that Daniel had been teaching Ethan Aikido since he could walk, not the forms but the principles, how to move with force rather than against it, how to find balance in motion, how to fall without fear. She learned that Ethan drew every day, that Daniel read to him every night, that they went to the park every Sunday to feed ducks who, according to Ethan, had very strong opinions about bread. When it was time to leave, Clara stood at the door, reluctant to return to her pristine space in the sky. Ethan tugged at her sleeve, handed her another paper crane, this one blue. For your desk, he said. So you remember you can be small and still fly. Walking to her car, Clara realized she'd left the volunteer forms on Daniel's counter. It didn't matter. She'd be back. She was back the next day and the next. Not to the apartment. Daniel had boundaries, and she respected them, but to the dojo, where she began assisting with the children's classes. The kids were suspicious at first. She was too polished, too precise, too much like the adults who usually disappointed them. But Ethan vouched for her in his serious way, and gradually they accepted her presence, then her help, then her. She and Daniel began training together after the official classes ended. Not sparring exactly, more like moving meditation, finding the spaces where their different styles could coexist. Clara's Aikido was all technique, perfect angles, and precisely applied force. Daniel's was something else, intuition made physical, a conversation with energy itself. When they moved together, something new emerged, neither his nor hers but theirs, a dialect of motion they were inventing as they went. You're thinking too much, Daniel would say when she tried to force a technique. You're not thinking enough, she'd counter when his intuition led him into awkward positions. But gradually, session by session, they found a middle way. Clara learned to trust her body's knowledge. Daniel learned to appreciate the beauty of perfect form. They pushed each other without competing, challenged without conquering. Ethan would sit in his corner, drawing, occasionally offering observations that sounded like nonsense but always proved profound. You're trying to be the same river. Now you're both water. This is the part where you stop being two. One evening, after a particularly fluid session, they sat on the edge of the mat, breathing hard, sweat making them both more human than their daily roles allowed. Daniel's hand rested on the mat near hers, not touching but present, a possibility rather than a fact. Why didn't you tell anyone? Clara asked. About your training, your background. You could teach, really teach, not just assist. Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching Ethan add details to his latest drawing. After Rachel died, I realized how much of my life I'd spent being visible, the hero firefighter, the dedicated husband, the man who ran toward danger. But all that visibility, all that being seen, it didn't save her. It didn't even help me see what mattered, until it was gone. So I chose to become invisible, to do small things with great attention rather than great things with small attention. Ethan doesn't need a father who's a hero. He needs a father who's present. But you're extraordinary, Clara said, the words coming out more intense than she'd intended. Daniel turned to look at her fully, and she saw in his eyes a kindness that made her chest ache. So is everyone, if you look at them right. The janitor at your office who knows exactly how you take your coffee. The security guard who remembers every employee's birthday. We're all extraordinary in quiet ways. I just chose to stop shouting about it. A month passed. Clara found herself spending less time in her office, delegating more, trusting her team in ways that initially terrified then liberated her. She'd arrive at the dojo early, help Daniel set up, watch him work with the patience of someone who'd learned that rushing rarely improved anything. They didn't talk about what was growing between them, but it was there in the space between their bodies when they trained, in the way Ethan had started including her in his drawings, always as part of their unit, never separate. Then came the community demonstration. Master Yamamoto had organized it as a fundraiser for the youth program, but it had grown into something larger, a celebration of Aikido, of community, of the beauty possible when power served rather than dominated. The gymnasium was packed, folding chairs filled with families, local press, even some of Clara's business associates who'd come out of curiosity about what their fierce CEO did in her spare time. The demonstrations began with the children, Ethan among them, showing basic movements with the solemnity of tiny warriors. Then the intermediate students, competent but still finding their way. The advanced class performed complex techniques that drew appreciative murmurs from the crowd. Then Master Yamamoto stood, his voice carrying despite his age. For our final demonstration, two of our most dedicated practitioners, Clara Vance, whose support has kept our doors open and our mission alive, and Daniel Cross, who ensures those doors open smoothly every day, in every way. The crowd's reaction was mixed recognition and excitement for Clara, polite confusion for Daniel. The janitor? Was this some kind of feel-good gesture? Clara and Daniel walked onto the mat from opposite sides, bowed to each other, and began. What followed couldn't properly be called a demonstration. It was more like watching water negotiate with stone, finding ways around and through, each shaping the other through patient persistence. Clara attacked with the precision of someone who'd devoted years to perfection. Daniel received her attacks like a shore receives waves, inevitably, peacefully, transforming force into rhythm. They sped up without hurrying, increased intensity without violence. Clara's techniques, which had always been about control, became questions Daniel answered with redirections that were themselves questions Clara had to solve. They stopped taking turns, stopped being attacker and defender, became something else, two parts of a single system, exploring the infinite ways energy could move between bodies. The crowd had gone silent. Even the children stopped fidgeting. What they were watching transcended martial arts, became something closer to dance, or poetry, or the visual representation of a conversation that had been going on since the universe decided to split itself into parts just to have someone to talk to. When they finally stopped, bowed, and stepped back, the silence held for 3 heartbeats. Then the gymnasium erupted. Not polite applause, but genuine awe, the sound people make when they've witnessed something that reminds them beauty exists, that harmony is possible, that strength doesn't always mean dominance. Clara and Daniel stood side by side, not touching but together, accepting the applause with matching slight smiles. In his corner, Ethan held up his latest drawing, 2 spirals, intertwined, neither beginning nor ending, just flowing into and through each other, creating something that was both and neither. Afterward, they went to their usual diner, the 3 of them squeezed into a booth meant for 2, eating noodles while the city rushed past outside. Clara still wore her demonstration gi. Daniel had changed back into his comfortable flannel. Ethan had sauce on his chin and didn't care. "They saw you," Clara said to Daniel. "Really saw you." Daniel twisted noodles around his fork, considering. "They saw what we made together. That's different from seeing me." "Why does it matter?" Ethan asked, looking between them with those 2 wise eyes. "Being seen?" Clara thought about her empire, built on being noticed, being remembered, being important. "I used to think being seen meant you mattered." "And now?" Daniel asked. "Now I think mattering happens in the spaces nobody sees. The quiet moments, the small kindnesses." She looked at Ethan's latest drawing, propped against the napkin dispenser, the 3 of them at this table, surrounded by light that seemed to come from inside rather than outside. The places where you don't have to be anything but what you are. "Dad says visibility is another kind of prison," Ethan offered, slurping his noodles with enthusiasm. Daniel laughed softly. "I said that about celebrity, buddy. There's a difference." "What difference?" Clara asked. "Celebrity is being seen for what you do. Being visible is just being seen, and being witnessed." He paused, met Clara's eyes. "Being witnessed is being seen for who you are, even the parts you'd rather hide. Especially those parts," Ethan added, then returned his attention to his food, as if he hadn't just delivered wisdom most adults never achieved. Later, after they'd walked Ethan home and put him to bed, Clara reading the bedtime story while Daniel listened from the doorway, a reversal that felt like crossing a bridge. Daniel led Clara to the roof of the building. It wasn't a garden or a deck, just a flat expanse of tar and gravel with a few folding chairs someone had optimistically placed there. But the view was honest, not the polished skyline Clara saw from her penthouse, but the real city, with its mix of light and shadow, beauty and plainness, the endless dance of ordinary lives. They sat in the folding chairs, shoulders touching, watching the city breathe. Clara thought about her penthouse, sterile and perfect, and how it had never felt like home, just like a museum where she displayed herself. "I've been thinking about your brother," Daniel said suddenly. "About Sam." Clara tensed, but Daniel's hand found hers, warm and steady. "You didn't kill him," Daniel continued. "You made a mistake. Those are different things. Rachel died because of a calculation error, someone's decision that a building was stable when it wasn't. That person has to live with that mistake. But it doesn't make them a killer, it makes them human." "How do you forgive them?" Clara asked. "The person whose mistake cost you everything?" Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "I don't. Forgiveness isn't mine to give, it was Rachel's, and she's not here to offer it. But I don't carry hatred either. I carry sadness and love and memory. Those are heavy enough without adding hatred to the load." They sat in silence, hands linked, watching planes blink across the sky like slow meteors. Clara felt something settling in her chest, not healing exactly, but the possibility of it, the idea that wounds could become something other than weapons. "I want to tell you something," she said, surprising herself. "I haven't been happy. Successful, yes. Accomplished, certainly. But not happy, not until. Until? Until a janitor told me not to cry, and a little boy gave me a paper crane, and I learned that being strong isn't the same as being hard." Daniel turned to look at her, and in the dim light, she could see him making a decision. "I want to tell you something too. I've been safe, invisible, protected. But also, dormant. Like I've been holding my breath for 3 years, afraid that if I started living again, it would mean Rachel hadn't mattered. But watching you learn to soften, to bend, it's reminded me that living isn't a betrayal of the dead. It's a gift to them, a promise that their love still moves in the world." Clara turned their linked hands over, studying the way their fingers fit together, different but complementary. "What are we doing, Daniel?" "I don't know," he admitted. But it feels like what Ethan draws, two things becoming a third thing without losing themselves. Your son might be a prophet, or just a kid who pays attention. Sometimes those are the same thing. A door creaked behind them. Ethan appeared in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "I had a dream," he announced. "You were both in it." Daniel stood, ready to take him back to bed, but Ethan walked past him to Clara, climbed into her lap with the confidence of someone who knew he'd be welcomed. Clara's arms came around him automatically, and she felt something ancient and right click into place. "What did you dream?" she asked. Ethan yawned enormously. "You were teaching me to fly. Not like a bird, like paper, folding and floating and finding the wind." "Was I good at it, the teaching?" Ethan considered this seriously. "You were learning. But that's better than being good. Dad says being good means you've stopped growing, but learning means you're still becoming." Daniel sat back down, his hand finding Clara's shoulder, and they sat there, a janitor, a CEO, and a wise child watching the city sleep, being a family before any of them had the words for it. 3 months later, Clara stood in the dojo, teaching a group of beginners the first principle of Aikido: blend with the attacker's energy rather than opposing it. She wore a simple gi, her hair in a loose ponytail, rather than her corporate armor bun. Her students included a grocery clerk, a retired librarian, 2 college students, and a woman who'd survived something she didn't talk about, but carried in the careful way she moved through space. "The goal isn't to win," Clara said, demonstrating a simple redirection. "It's to transform conflict into something else: understanding, balance, even harmony. Your attacker isn't your enemy. They're your teacher, showing you where your balance needs work." Daniel watched from the doorway, supposedly fixing a loose hinge, but really just watching Clara teach. She'd resigned as CEO 2 weeks ago, keeping her board position but stepping away from daily operations. The business media had gone crazy. Why would someone at the peak of their power step down? But Clara had just smiled at the reporters and said she'd found something more important than power: purpose. Now she taught at the dojo 4 days a week, worked with at-risk youth, and was developing a program that used Aikido principles for conflict resolution in schools. She'd traded her penthouse for a smaller apartment in Daniel and Ethan's building, still nice, but human-sized, with windows that opened and neighbors who knew her name. "Clara-sensei," one of the students called. "What if someone's really trying to hurt you? What if they won't stop?" Clara glanced at Daniel, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. "Then you do what's necessary to protect yourself and others. But even then, you use only the force required, nothing more. True strength isn't about what you can do to someone, it's about what you choose not to do, even when you could." After class, as students filtered out, Clara and Daniel reset the space together, moving in the synchronized way of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. Ethan sat in his corner, working on what he called his big project, a series of drawings that told a story he wouldn't explain, but that seemed to involve a lot of spirals and cranes and figures holding hands. "Final lesson of the day?" Daniel asked, standing in the center of the mat. Clara smiled, stepped into position. "Always." They began to move, no longer 2 people sparring, but 2 aspects of the same practice, exploring the infinite ways balance could be lost and found and lost again. Clara attacked, Daniel redirected. Daniel countered, Clara flowed around him. They sped up, slowed down, found rhythms that shouldn't exist but did, created momentary architectures of motion that dissolved as soon as they formed. Watching them, Ethan added the final panel to his story: 2 figures, no longer separate, dancing or fighting or simply moving. It was impossible to tell which, and it didn't matter. Above them, paper cranes filled the sky, and below them, the earth was soft with rain, and everything was exactly as difficult and beautiful as it needed to be. They ended as they always did: no victor, no vanquished, just 2 people remembering how to be human together. Clara's hand found Daniel's, and they stood there, breathing hard, sweating, alive. "Home?" Danielle asked. "Home," Clara agreed. They collected Ethan, who packed up his drawings carefully, secretively, saving them for some future revelation only he could see coming. Walking out together, Clara noticed Sensei Hartwell's car in the parking lot. He'd been coming around lately, trying to understand what Daniel had that he didn't. What made a janitor move like water while he, with all his certifications, still moved like stone trying to be wind. "Should we tell him?" Clara asked. "Tell him what?" Daniel replied. "The secret. How you became what you are." Daniel considered this as they walked, Ethan between them, holding both their hands. "There's no secret. Just time and loss, and choosing to let it make you softer instead of harder. But that's not something you can tell someone. It's something they have to learn by breaking and healing, and breaking again until they realize the breaking is part of the practice." "That's a hard lesson," Clara said. "The hard lessons are the only ones that stick," Ethan piped up. "Like how you can't unfold a crane back into paper. It remembers what it became." They walked on, three shadows stretching long in the evening light, pointing toward tomorrow. Behind them, the dojo stood quiet, full of ghosts and possibilities. Ahead, their small apartment waited, with its mismatched furniture and walls covered in Ethan's art and windows that looked out on ordinary streets where extraordinary people lived their quiet lives. As they turned the corner, Clara caught a glimpse of their reflection in a shop window, a family, unconventional but unmistakable. She'd spent so many years building walls, thinking strength meant standing alone, immovable, untouchable. But here, walking between Daniel and Ethan, she understood what real strength was. The courage to be vulnerable, to be seen, not for your accomplishments, but for your scars, to choose connection over protection, again and again, even when you knew it meant you could be hurt. "Tell me a story," Ethan requested as they climbed the stairs to their floor. "What kind of story?" Clara asked. "A true one. About someone who learned to cry." Clara and Daniel exchanged glances over his head. "I know that story," Clara said. "It starts with a question. What if the strongest person in the room was actually the weakest? And what if the weakest was actually the strongest? And what if strength and weakness were just different words for the same thing being human?" "That's a good beginning," Ethan approved. "Tell me the rest." So Clara did, walking up the stairs, through their door, into their home. She told him about mountains and guilt, about paper cranes and patient janitors, about learning to dissolve instead of standing firm. She told him about his father's grace and his own wisdom, about the way love could grow in the spaces between people like those mushrooms that connected whole forests underground, invisible but essential. By the time she finished, Ethan was asleep on the couch, his latest drawing clutched in his hand. Daniel covered him with a blanket, then joined Clara at the window, where city lights made constellations that meant nothing and everything. "Thank you," Clara said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. For being patient while I learned to stop fighting. For Ethan. For this." She gestured at the apartment, the sleeping child, the quiet life they'd built from the wreckage of their separate griefs. Daniel wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Thank you for being brave enough to be seen. For teaching me it's okay to be visible again. For showing Ethan that families can be chosen as well as born." They stood there, watching the city sleep. Two people who'd learned that healing wasn't about forgetting pain, but about transforming it into something useful: compost for new growth, foundation for new structures. Reminder that breaking wasn't the end of the story, but sometimes the beginning. In his sleep, Ethan mumbled something that sounded like cranes or possibly chains with him. It could mean anything, probably meant everything. His drawing slipped from his fingers, and Clara could see it was them, all three of them, standing in rain that looked like light, or light that looked like rain. Impossible to tell which, and unnecessary to decide. The city hummed its nighttime song. Somewhere, someone was falling in love. Somewhere else, someone was letting go. In a small apartment, 3 floors up from the ordinary street, 3 people who'd found each other in the ruins of their separate lives, slept and watched and held each other. Not because they were healed, but because they were healing. Not because they were whole, but because they'd learned that broken things could still be beautiful, still be home. Healing isn't a headline. It's a quiet choice you make when no one is clapping. It's a paper crane folded from resignation letters. It's teaching beginners to fall safely while remembering your own falls. It's choosing to mop floors when you could be teaching grandmasters, because presence matters more than recognition. It's a child's drawing that sees through time. It's 2 spirals becoming one without losing their separate curves. It's learning that strength isn't about being unbreakable. It's about breaking well, with grace, with others, into something more beautiful than wholeness ever was.
The rain hammered against the windows of Sterling Industries' towering headquarters as Marcus Hayes stood in the marble lobby, his worn leather boots creating small puddles on the pristine floor. Victoria Sterling's voice cut through the air like ice, each word dripping with disdain as she circled him like a predator sizing up prey. "You dare show your face here?" she hissed, her designer heels clicking against the floor. "A man like you, thinking you belong in my world?" The security guards moved closer, their hands reaching for Marcus's shoulders. But he stood firm, his weathered hands clenched at his sides, thinking only of the little girl waiting for him at home. Marcus Hayes had not always been the man standing in that lobby. 6 years ago, he had walked away from a life that most men only dreamed of. Trading boardrooms for bedtime stories, corporate mergers for morning pancakes, and international acclaim for the innocent laughter of his daughter Sophie. The transformation had been complete and deliberate, a choice made in a hospital room where he held a tiny bundle of life while machines beeped their final farewell to his wife, Claire. In that moment, as Sophie's tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, Marcus made a promise that would reshape his entire existence. He would be the father she needed, even if it meant burying the man he used to be so deep that no one would ever find him again. The penthouse apartment became a modest two-bedroom rental in Brooklyn. The designer suits transformed into flannel shirts and jeans, and the name that once commanded respect in 5 languages became just another face in the crowd of parents at Roosevelt Elementary School. Sophie Hayes was 7 years old, with her mother's emerald eyes and her father's determined chin, a combination that made her both beautiful and formidable in the innocent way that only children can manage. She possessed an intelligence that surprised her teachers and a kindness that made her beloved among her classmates. But most of all, she had an unshakable faith in her father that could move mountains. Every morning she would wake up to the smell of scrambled eggs and toast, prepared by hands that she didn't know had once signed deals worth billions. And every night, she would fall asleep to stories told by a voice that had once addressed the United Nations. To Sophie, Marcus wasn't a mystery or a man with secrets. He was simply Dad, the one who braided her hair with patient fingers, who knew exactly how much chocolate syrup belonged in her milk, and who could make any monster under the bed disappear with just his presence. Victoria Sterling ruled her empire from the top floor of a building that scraped the Manhattan sky, a monument to ambition built on the foundation of her father's legacy and expanded through her own ruthless brilliance. At 34, she had achieved what most couldn't in a lifetime, transforming Sterling Industries from a successful company into a global powerhouse that influenced markets on 3 continents. Her beauty was weaponized perfection. From her platinum blonde hair that never had a strand out of place to her wardrobe that cost more than most people's annual salaries. She had learned early that power was the only currency that mattered, and she collected it the way others collected art, displaying it in every gesture, every word, every calculated smile that never quite reached her Arctic blue eyes. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford, kindness a weakness she couldn't tolerate, and mercy a word that had been excised from her vocabulary along with failure and compromise. The world existed to serve her vision, and those who couldn't keep up were simply obstacles to be removed or ignored. The collision of these 2 worlds began on an unseasonably warm Tuesday in October, when Marcus stood outside Sterling Industries with a manila envelope that contained Sophie's medical records and a plea that had cost him more pride than he had left to spare. Sophie needed a specialized treatment that only Sterling Medical, a subsidiary of Victoria's empire, could provide. And the insurance company had denied coverage for what they deemed an experimental procedure. He had exhausted every other option, liquidated what little savings he had managed to accumulate, and even swallowed his pride enough to reach out to old contacts who might remember him, though none had responded. Standing in that lobby, watching the suited executive stream past him like he was invisible, Marcus felt the weight of his choices pressing down on his shoulders. The receptionist, a young woman named Jennifer with sympathetic eyes and a nervous smile, had tried to explain that Miss Sterling didn't take unscheduled appointments, that there were procedures and protocols, proper channels that needed to be followed. But Marcus had learned long ago that sometimes the proper channels were designed to keep people like him, people who looked like him now, from ever reaching the people who could actually help. The confrontation that followed would become legend among the Sterling Industries employees, whispered about in break rooms and discussed in hushed tones over coffee. Victoria had emerged from her private elevator like an avenging angel dressed in Armani, her face a mask of controlled fury at the disruption to her carefully orchestrated day. She took one look at Marcus, at his flannel shirt and worn jeans, at the desperation barely concealed behind his dignified posture, and her lip curled in disgust. "Security," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been disobeyed. "Remove this man immediately." But Marcus didn't move. Didn't even flinch when the guards grabbed his arms. Instead, he looked directly at Victoria, and something in his gaze made her pause, though she would never admit it. "My daughter is sick," he said, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "She needs treatment that only your medical division can provide. I'm not asking for charity. I can work for it. Pay it back over time. Please." The pleas seemed to physically pain him, and Victoria noticed, filing it away as another sign of weakness. Victoria's laugh was crystalline and cruel, echoing off the marble walls like breaking glass. "Work for it? she repeated, her voice dripping with amusement. And what exactly could you possibly do for Sterling Industries? Do you have any idea who I am? What this company represents? We don't hire people off the street because they have sob stories. She walked closer, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Every day, hundreds of people want something from me. Money, jobs, favors, miracles. If I helped every single parent with a sick child, I'd be bankrupt within a month. The employees who had gathered to watch the spectacle shifted uncomfortably, but none dared to intervene. Marcus felt the heat rise in his face, but he kept his voice level. I'm not every parent, he said quietly. I'm one father, asking for one chance. Test me. Give me any job, any task. Let me prove that I'm worth the investment. Victoria studied him for a long moment, and a smile played at the corners of her mouth, but it wasn't kind. It was the smile of a cat who had just noticed that the mouse was willing to play. Fine, Victoria said, her decision surprising everyone, including herself. You want a chance? I'll give you a chance. But not because I believe in you or your little sob story. I'll give you a chance because I think it will be amusing to watch you fail. She turned to Jennifer, who was watching with wide eyes. Put him in maintenance. Night shift. He can start tonight. She looked back at Marcus, her blue eyes glittering with malice. You'll work here for 6 months. If you last that long without missing a single shift, without a single complaint, without causing any problems, I'll consider reviewing your daughter's case. Consider, not guarantee. And if you fail, if you miss even one day, if you're late even once, you leave and never come back. Do we have a deal? The terms were harsh, almost impossible for a single parent with a sick child, and Victoria knew it. She expected him to refuse, to storm out in anger, or break down in defeat. Instead, Marcus extended his hand, his grip firm when she reluctantly shook it. Deal, he said simply. And for just a moment, Victoria felt something she couldn't quite identify, a flicker of something that might have been respect if she had been capable of feeling such a thing for someone so far beneath her station. That night, Marcus reported to the basement of Sterling Industries, where the maintenance supervisor, a gruff man named Earl Patterson, looked him up and down with skeptical eyes. So you're the one who made a scene upstairs, Earl said, handing him a uniform that had seen better days. Miss Sterling called down herself. Told me to give you the worst jobs we got. Said she wants daily reports on your performance. He paused, studying Marcus's face. Look, I don't know what you did to piss her off, but this ain't gonna be easy. The night shift handles all the dirty work, the stuff the day crew won't touch. You sure you want to do this? Marcus thought of Sophie, at home with Mrs. Chen from next door, doing her homework and waiting for his call to say goodnight. I'm sure, he said, and something in his tone made Earl nod slowly. The first night was hell. Marcus cleaned bathrooms that executives had soiled, scrubbed floors that seemed to accumulate dirt faster than he could clean them, and emptied trash bins filled with the remnants of lives far removed from his current reality. His hands, once soft from signing documents, blistered and bled. His back, strong as it was, ached from constant bending and lifting. But every time he wanted to quit, every time the humiliation threatened to overwhelm him, he thought of Sophie's face when he had promised her that everything would be okay. The other maintenance workers watched him with a mixture of pity and curiosity. There was Raymond Cruz, a father of 3 who had been working nights for 5 years, and Dmitry Volkov, a Russian immigrant who spoke broken English but whose eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen too much. They didn't understand why someone like Marcus, who clearly didn't belong there, would subject himself to this work, but they recognized determination when they saw it. You got kids? Raymond asked during a break on the 3rd night, offering Marcus a cup of coffee from his thermos. When Marcus nodded, Raymond's expression softened. Then you'll make it. We all do what we got to do for our kids. Dmitry nodded in agreement, adding in his thick accent, in Russia, I was engineer. Here, I clean toilets. But my children, they go to good school, have better life. Is worth it, no? Marcus found himself oddly comforted by their acceptance, by the simple understanding that came from shared sacrifice. Victoria, meanwhile, watched from her ivory tower, receiving Earl's daily reports with increasing interest. She had expected Marcus to quit within a week, had bet her personal assistant, James Morrison, $1,000 that he wouldn't last the month. But every morning, Earl's report was the same. Hayes showed up on time, worked without complaint, did everything asked of him and more. She found herself staying late some nights, watching the security monitors as Marcus pushed his cart through the halls, his movements efficient despite his obvious exhaustion. There was something about the way he carried himself, a dignity that the uniform and the menial work couldn't strip away, that nagged at her. She told herself it was simple curiosity, the same interest one might have in watching an ant carry a load 10 times its weight. But sometimes, when she saw him pause to stretch his back or notice the careful way he organized his supplies, she felt that flicker again, stronger now, threatening to become something she couldn't ignore. Sophie, for her part, adapted to the new routine with the resilience that only children possess. She understood that Daddy had to work at night now, that he would be tired during the day, but she never complained. Instead, she became his cheerleader, leaving notes in his lunch bag that said things like, "You're the best daddy in the world, and I love you to the moon and back." She drew pictures of him as a superhero, complete with a cape and muscles, which made Marcus laugh even when his body ached so much he could barely move. Mrs. Chen, their elderly neighbor, had become like a grandmother to Sophie, teaching her to make dumplings and helping with homework while Marcus slept during the day. The arrangement wasn't perfect, but it worked, held together by love and determination and the kind of hope that refuses to die even in the darkest circumstances. 3 weeks into his employment, the first test came. Victoria had arranged for a special board meeting, one that would run late into the night, and she specifically requested that the maintenance crew clean the boardroom while the meeting was in session. It was unheard of, a deliberate humiliation designed to break Marcus's composure. As he entered the room with his cart, 20 pairs of eyes turned to look at him, including Victoria's, which glittered with cruel anticipation. The board members, titans of industry all, looked through him as if he were invisible, continuing their discussion about quarterly projections and market expansions. Marcus moved silently around the room, emptying wastebaskets and wiping down surfaces, his face a mask of professional indifference. But as he worked, he listened, and what he heard made his hands clench around the mop handle. They were discussing a merger that he knew, from his past life, would be disastrous. A move that looked good on paper, but would ultimately cost thousands of jobs and tank the stock within 2 years. Every instinct screamed at him to speak up, to save them from their mistake, but he bit his tongue until it bled, remembering Sophie, remembering his promise. One board member, Harrison Blackwood, deliberately knocked over his coffee as Marcus passed, the hot liquid splashing across the mahogany table and onto the floor. "Clean that up," he said dismissively, not even looking at Marcus. Victoria watched, waiting for the explosion, for the moment when Marcus would break and reveal his true nature. Instead, he simply nodded, got down on his knees, and began cleaning the spill with methodical precision. As he worked, his mind cataloged everything. The nervous tick in Blackwood's left eye that indicated he was bluffing about his division's numbers. The way Victoria's CFO, Nathan Cross, kept checking his phone with increasing anxiety, suggesting problems he wasn't sharing. The subtle alliance forming between two board members who were clearly planning a power play. Information had always been his weapon of choice, and even now, reduced to this, he couldn't help but gather it, store it, analyze it. The meeting continued around him as if he were furniture, and when he finally left, Victoria felt an unexpected disappointment that he hadn't cracked. The next morning, something unusual happened. An anonymous memo appeared on Victoria's desk, written on plain paper with no identifying marks. It contained a brief but devastating analysis of the proposed merger, outlining exactly why it would fail and suggesting an alternative approach that would achieve the same goals without the risks. Victoria read it 3 times, her heart racing as she recognized the brilliant strategic mind behind the words. She called in her security team, demanding to know how someone had accessed her office, but the cameras showed nothing unusual. The memo's suggestions were so compelling that she presented them to the board as her own ideas, and they were unanimously approved. But the question nagged at her. Who had written it? She found herself looking at her employees differently, searching for signs of hidden intelligence. But her gaze kept returning to the security footage of Marcus cleaning the boardroom, his face revealing nothing as chaos swirled around him. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus became a fixture in the Sterling Industries ecosystem, albeit one that existed in the shadows. The night shift workers had accepted him as one of their own, and he found an unexpected camaraderie in their shared struggles. Raymond taught him tricks for making the work easier on his body, while Dmitri shared stories of his homeland that made the long nights pass more quickly. Even Earl had warmed to him, occasionally bringing extra sandwiches that his wife had made, gruffly insisting that Marcus needed to keep his strength up. But it was the small interactions with the day staff that began to shift the atmosphere in subtle ways. Marcus had a habit of leaving the offices he cleaned slightly better organized than he found them, fixing small problems that others hadn't even noticed. A wobbly desk chair would suddenly be stable. A flickering light would be repaired. A coffee maker that had been making strange noises would run smoothly again. The junior executives began to notice these small improvements, and whispers started to circulate about the mysterious night janitor who seemed to have an uncanny ability to fix problems. Jessica Park, a young analyst in the financial department, had been struggling with a complex spreadsheet for days when she came in one morning to find a sticky note on her monitor with a simple formula that solved everything. She had no idea who had left it, but she suspected it was the quiet man she sometimes saw in the early mornings when she came in early. Thomas Wright from IT swore that someone had reorganized his server room in a way that improved efficiency by 30%, but the security footage just showed Marcus cleaning, never touching the equipment. These small mysteries began to add up, creating a legend around the night janitor who might be more than he seemed. Victoria noticed the changes too, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what was different. The building ran more smoothly. Problems were solved before they became crises. And there was a subtle shift in the energy of the place that she couldn't explain. She found herself staying later and later, telling herself it was because of work, but really she was watching, waiting, trying to catch Marcus in the act of being extraordinary. One night she confronted him directly, appearing suddenly in a hallway as he was mopping. "It's you, isn't it?" she said, her voice accusatory. "The memo, the improvements, all of it." "Who are you really?" Marcus looked up from his work, his face carefully neutral. "I'm just a janitor, Miss Sterling," he said quietly. A father trying to earn medical care for his daughter. The simplicity of his response, the quiet dignity in his voice, made her angrier than any defiance could have. "Nobody is just anything," she snapped. "Everyone has secrets. What are yours?" But Marcus simply returned to his mopping, and after a moment, Victoria stormed off, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. The truth about Marcus's past was both simpler and more complex than Victoria could have imagined. He had once been Marcus Blackstone, the legendary consultant known as the Ghost in corporate circles. A man who could turn failing companies into gold mines and who commanded fees that made even CEOs blanch. He had built his reputation on an almost supernatural ability to see patterns others missed, to understand not just businesses but the people who ran them. His wife, Claire, had been his anchor, the one who kept him grounded when the demands of his work threatened to consume him. They had met in college when he was just a brilliant kid with big dreams, and she was the artist who saw the world in colors he couldn't imagine. She had supported him through the lean years, celebrated with him during the victories, and when she got sick, he had thrown every resource at his disposal into trying to save her. But cancer doesn't care about money or connections, and in the end, all his success meant nothing. She died 6 hours after Sophie was born, her last words a plea for him to be the father their daughter deserved. The decision to disappear had been instantaneous and irrevocable. Marcus Blackstone died with Claire, and Marcus Hayes was born in a small apartment in Brooklyn, where he learned to braid hair from online tutorials and to make mac and cheese exactly the way Sophie liked it. He had enough money saved to last a lifetime if they lived modestly. But he had chosen to work normal jobs, to give Sophie a normal life, to be present in a way that Marcus Blackstone never could have been. The construction work, the delivery driving, the temporary positions. They were all part of a deliberate transformation, a way of becoming someone new. He had thought he could leave the corporate world behind entirely, but life has a way of circling back. And here he was, cleaning the offices of people who would have paid millions for his advice, all for the chance to save his daughter. 4 months into his employment, Sophie's condition worsened. She had been managing with basic treatments, but the doctors were clear. Without the experimental procedure, she had perhaps a year, maybe less. Marcus stood in the hospital room, watching his little girl sleep, her face pale against the white pillows, and felt rage build in his chest. Not at Victoria or Sterling Industries, but at himself. For choosing pride over pragmatism. For not revealing himself and demanding what his reputation could have commanded. But then Sophie opened her eyes, smiled at him, and said, "Don't look so sad, Daddy. Everything's going to be okay. You promised, remember?" And in that moment, he knew he would continue, would endure any humiliation, would sacrifice every shred of pride he had left. Because she believed in him, and that was worth more than all the corporate victories he had ever achieved. The night that changed everything started like any other. Marcus was cleaning the executive floor, working his way methodically through the offices, when he heard shouting from Victoria's office. Through the partially open door, he could see her on a video call with someone, her face flushed with anger and something that looked almost like fear. "That's impossible," she was saying. "The algorithms are proprietary. No one outside the company even knows they exist." The person on the screen was speaking rapidly, but Marcus couldn't make out the words. Then Victoria said something that made his blood run cold. "If this gets out, if the SEC finds out what we've been doing, it's not just the company that goes down. We're talking about criminal charges, Harrison, prison." Marcus recognized the name Harrison Blackwood, the same board member who had spilled coffee on him months ago. He was about to move away when Victoria slammed her laptop shut and put her head in her hands. And for the first time since he'd met her, she looked vulnerable, human, scared. Marcus made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone else. He knocked on the door, Victoria's head snapped up, her vulnerability immediately replaced by fury. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. This floor should have been cleaned hours ago. Marcus entered the office, closing the door behind him. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said carefully. "You have a problem with the Blackwood situation." Victoria stood, her body rigid with tension. "You were eavesdropping? I'll have you fired immediately." "Security." But Marcus held up a hand. "Before you do that, let me ask you something. The algorithm he's talking about, is it the one you use for high-frequency trading? The one that analyzes market patterns in real time and makes microsecond decisions?" Victoria's face went white. "How could you possibly know about that?" Marcus walked to her whiteboard, picked up a marker, and began writing. "Because the vulnerability isn't in the algorithm itself. It's in the implementation. You're using a recursive function that doesn't properly sanitize inputs, which means someone who knows what they're doing could inject false data that would make the algorithm trade against itself." For 5 minutes, Marcus wrote, explaining in precise detail not just the problem but the solution, his hand moving with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Victoria watched in stunned silence as the janitor she had humiliated for months revealed an understanding of complex financial systems that rivaled her best engineers. When he finished, he set down the marker and turned to face her. "You have about 6 hours before Blackwood's people crack the rest of the system," he said quietly. "If you implement these changes now, you can not only stop them but trace the attack back to its source, which will give you the evidence you need to have him removed from the board and potentially arrested for corporate espionage." Victoria stared at him, then at the board, then back at him. "Who are you?" she whispered. Marcus was about to answer when his phone rang. It was the hospital. Sophie had collapsed at Mrs. Chen's apartment and was being rushed to emergency surgery. The next few hours were a blur. Marcus ran from the building, Victoria's shouts echoing behind him. But he didn't care about the job anymore, didn't care about the deal or the consequences. He arrived at the hospital to find Sophie in critical condition, the doctors speaking in hushed, urgent tones about procedures and permissions and insurance that wouldn't cover what needed to be done. He was about to reveal everything, to call in every favor from his past life, when Victoria Sterling walked into the hospital waiting room, flanked by the best medical team money could buy. "Where is she?" Victoria demanded. And when the doctors tried to explain about protocols and procedures, she cut them off with a look that could have frozen hell. "I don't care about your protocols. That girl gets whatever she needs. Sterling Industries will cover everything. And I mean everything." She turned to